And with no further ado, please welcome Randall Kenan.
I'm going to follow in Morris Manning's footsteps and quote Minnie Pearl. I'm so proud for you to see me. Wyatt, you must feel like Tom Huck Finn. Hearing all these people, reading your obituary. But I want to thank you, and I'm glad you're here to hear it. Very happy to be here. I wanted to say, 50 years ago today, this was before Mark Drummond was born, I was watching TV. And you know what I was watching? The Miracle Worker. Patty Duke, Anne Bancroft. And that movie had a huge impact on me. I mean, that feral child and this woman who was losing her own eyesight, teaching Helen Keller how to read, which was actually this great title because it was miraculous. Later on that night, that evening, I didn't get to see the end because it was preempted by that other thing that happened. But imagine that whenever I think of the Miracle Worker, I think of human beings on the moon. Whenever I think of human beings on the moon, I think of the Miracle Worker teaching a blind, mute child how to read, blind, deaf, mute child how to read. And so, and to be, that young and to get situational irony that Anne Sullivan was losing her eyesight and doing it was great. So that's my little historical thing. I'm going to start by reading my tribute to Sewanee. That's going to be in the Sewanee Review. It's about a fella. The most memorable moments of my time at Sewanee tend to be the less predictable, unscheduled, highly human moments like those with Barry Hannah in the latter days of the conference. Like the ill-fated night he decided to light up a cigarette in the downstairs bathroom of the Women's Center during a Richard Bausch reading, causing the alarms to thunder and pushing Bausch into a comedic show until the alarms were doused 20 minutes later. Or after I had spent time with Barry in Fayetteville, Arkansas at a conference, and in the little airport we shared coffee and stories, and he asked me about rap music and to whom he should listen. Much to my surprise, I suggested Eminem, whose recent album I had found particularly refreshing. The next year at Sewanee, I was talking with some participants, 3 young fellows outside the Women's Center, and Barry walked by. He stopped, turned to look at me and said, "Randall, I like that Eminem fella. Good stuff," and walked on by. I would pay good money to get young men to have such looks on their faces again and to regard me with such perplexed awe. And then there were the actual readings. In truth, I had reviewed Barry's story collection, Bats Out of Hell, for the Boston Globe when it first came out in 1993. I adored the book and essentially said so, but as book critics are wont to do, I mentioned the stories I found to be of lesser impact. I had never met Barry Hannah, but had heard stories of his ability to be quite the madman, bringing guns to school and laying them down in a desk in front of him, attacking people with bows and arrows. Probably more myth than reality, I thought then, but now I know better. The next year, I agreed to do a reading in New York City at the 92nd Street Y and learned I would be paired with Barry Hannah. As you can imagine, this meeting provoked a great deal of anxiety in me. I had no cause for worry. Not only was Barry Hannah a gentleman of the highest order towards me, but I discovered that night he was also a virtuoso reader of his own prose. Listening to Barry give a public reading was a tour de force. Barry could deliver a story with a quiet calmness like a Yo-Yo Ma solo. Steady, sonorous, yet underneath, as with the best of Bach's inventions, a simmering, symmetrical heat built and built. His unusual sentences, part Thomas Pynchon, part Flannery O'Connor, spoken with his guitar-strung Mississippi accent, left listeners spellbound. And the sheer force of his storytelling, by turns insane, throbbing with wild humanity, tender mercies, and withering insights, had the audience wild with laughter. Barry loved himself some Bob Dylan. He told me and others on many occasions his favorite album was Blood on the Tracks. The source of the title of his last book, You Understand You're Orphan, came from the Dylan song, It's All Over Baby Blue. One conversation I regret I never got to have with Barry over on the porch of the French house was what he thought of Dylan having won the Nobel Prize. I think he would have approved. Okay. I'm going to read a new story. It's called God's Gonna Trouble the Water, or Where is Mary Saul? Mrs. Streeter was down in Barbados being chased by monkeys when the storm struck. Her son, Aaron, had sent her on vacation with his daughter, Desiree. The two had been returning from a trip to the caverns, the spooky Harrison Cave with its stone pillars hanging down and sticking straight up, when the hooligans showed up. Green monkeys, but a brownish gray they were, with white furry breasts and menacing red eyes. Desiree had found it amusing at first, but at 82, the widow wondered about the promises her son had made about the recuperative powers of the Caribbean and ocean breeze. As she listened to the monkeys, hooting and howling and grunting, she felt it might be better for her to be at home tending her okra and string beans. Desiree pushed her scooter faster than the monkeys ran. Mrs. Streeter had a problematic back and couldn't do a lot of long-distance walking. Desiree was only 18, a college student at Spelman. The mischievous bandits seemed to have no objective, no reason, just causing trouble. But this did not inspire solace. Desiree kept pace with the troop and made it back to the shuttle safely, helped her grandmother climb on board. I was so scared, Nana. I was worried, child. I'm glad I wasn't on foot. Lord have mercy. Nobody told me there'd be monkeys. When they got back to the resort, murmurs were going on all about the lobby from other guests, mostly Americans. Clearly, something was afoot. 2 hurricanes were in the forecast, one headed for Barbados and one headed for the North Carolina coast, home. In truth, the Barbadian encounter with wind and rain felt like a mere thunderstorm. It came and went the next night in a hurry, leaving little damage. But the news regarding the coast was not so benign. Category 5, they were predicting. The governor was calling for evacuations. It looked like Mrs. Streeter would not be going home. But that is where she longed to be, deep in her heart. Floods and wind be damned. Back in the States, 2 days later, Aaron met them at Dulles Airport and insisted his mother stay with him till conditions at home got safe. His townhouse was in Alexandria, and the sun was shining. Hard to imagine how different things were at that moment back in Thames Creek. The storm was supposed to hit land the next morning. Girl, it's been raining hard for the last 2 days straight. I mean, a hard rain, too. All the creeks and rivers are about to spill over. Mrs. Streeter had been on the phone with her sister back home several times each day. Are y'all gonna leave? No, child. Clay says we'll be just fine. You remember that last flood we stayed high and dry, and the water got pretty high, a little all around town in the lower spots. We're gonna take our chances. Mrs. Streeter's days were largely CNN and the Weather Channel and talking on the phone from the time Aaron left for work until he returned. Some days she'd cook his favorite meals, her special spaghetti, smothered chicken, oxtail soup. It was nice that he did all the shopping. Or he would take her to a nice restaurant. She really enjoyed that place called Busboys and Poets. They had some really nice shrimp and grits, and she enjoyed their Cobb salad. The young folks these days sure wore their hair in some peculiar styles and colors. After weeks, she worried more and more about home. They said miles and miles of Interstate 40 were still covered by water. Her sister told her power had been out all week. And you know that great big oak tree in front of Mama's house? Girl, it snapped in two. It blocked the road for 3 days before they could get at it and haul it out. That tree was truly massive, too tall to climb, probably close to 200 years old. It had been there when her great-grandfather built the house. Mrs. Streeter finally remembered playing on its great gnarled roots as a girl. Something twanged at the bottom of her heart. Now she was even more worried about her vegetable garden, a thing in which she took great pride and spent a lot of time and effort cultivating. Her doctor had once told her her longevity and robust health, even when considering the back problems and mobility, was surely aided by her daily exertions in that great big plot of land, a third of an acre large. She had been trying for days to reach the woman who helped her out a few days a week, but she could get no answer. This silence made her worry all the more. Marisol Cifuentes was a pleasant, dark-eyed woman with a gentle manner. Aaron, after the back operation, wanted to pay someone to come help with cleaning and various chores around the house. Mrs. Streeter insisted that she would be fine on her own, but Aaron insisted. Some of his high school buddies recommended Mrs. Cifuentes, who was in her mid-20s and who often brought her 2 girls along, Lourdes, age 8, and Inez, age 6. Her husband, Simetrio, worked as a logger down in the swamps. He ran heavy equipment. They lived in a trailer park about 8 miles away. In time, Mrs. Streeter grew to like Marisol and looked forward to seeing the girls who would sit and watch television with her, color in their coloring books, or fiddle with their phones. She remembered the day Inez asked her sister, "Can you itch my scratch for me?" and how it made her laugh out loud. Surely they had gotten out in time, God knows. That trailer park was awfully close to the Chinkapin River. Finally, 8 days after returning stateside, she caught a plane home. Her sister had told her the coast was clear, the water was largely gone. Her brother-in-law Clay picked her up at the Raleigh-Durham airport. She had already been filled with something like dread, though darker, about what she would find at home. Once pulling off the interstate into York County and driving down the country roads to Thames Creek, the dread grew thicker. The roadsides along the way, in front of a great many houses, were littered with piles and piles of ruined and soggy sheetrock, waterlogged mattresses, useless refrigerators and other appliances, all manner of refuse. Such a sight makes a person wonder about the hours of work to be done and already done. Her mood lightened a little when Clay turned into the driveway. The brick ranch-style house her husband had built for them back in 1972 was standing proud. The flood had not budged it. Now for the insides. Clay came with her. As soon as she opened the garage, the foulest odor she had ever smelt greeted her. It smelt like death itself, a profusion of fish and shrimp, spoiled. Even clothes of 2 freezers kept in the garage reeked from the spoilage. Also gone were all the corn and okra and butter beans and squash and collards and cabbage she'd grown, not to mention the blueberries and pears and peaches and sweet potatoes she had frozen for pies. The water did not enter. The lack of power had struck. Damn, the widow rarely swore, if ever, but this was one of those occasions. Clay took her luggage to her room. The lights were back on. The water was running. She inspected the refrigerator, which, of course, was in bad shape, as can be expected. Otherwise, the house seemed intact. As for the garden, it was indeed a total loss. All the plants had drowned. The water had caused most of the rows to erode away and melt away. There was little green left, mostly yellow and brown and black. The sweet potatoes had commenced to rot. She knew it would be weeks before the ground would be dry enough for replanting. She let out a frustrated sigh. Jesus help me. After many hours on the phone, arranging for someone to come to help her clean the freezer in the garage in the morning, filling in Aaron and Desiree, and catching up with her sister and all the news around town, she finally went to bed for the first time in 2 weeks in her own bed. And she slept like the proverbial baby. Mrs. Streeter woke to the sound of a vacuum cleaner and the sounds of little girls' laughter. Marisol! She let herself in. She's okay. Mrs. Streeter took her time but moved with some haste, eager to see mother and children and to tell her all about her trip and to hear about the storm and how they fared. But when she rounded the corner, down the hall into the family room, she was met by no vacuum cleaner, no little girls, no mother. The room was silent and empty, save for the light pooling in through the sheer curtains. The sense of bewilderment in her breast was a thing akin to her dead garden out back. How could she imagine such a thing? Why? It took 2 cups of decaf coffee and the entire Today Show to get her relaxed, finally. One of her cousins, Noreen, showed up to help her empty and clean the stinky freezer and to mop up the leakage that had spread all over the 2-car expanse. This was a nauseating task, full of elbow grease and discarded once deliciousness. It took several cleanings to get rid of the stench, which somehow lingered faintly for days. Still, no word from Marisol. No one was answering her cell. The widow decided to take a drive. The small community where the trailer park was located was known locally as Scuffletown. No one spoke with her. No one she spoke with knew how the tiny huddle of farms and houses had fared, being so low and so close to the river. A great many trees had toppled over in the woods on either side of the road. As she approached, she witnessed more and more damage. When she got there, the trailers was off their mounts, clearly having floated into odd and strange configurations, some overturned. Many lights poles downed and wires downed and exposed. Surely the Cifuentes got out. Surely they were okay, Lord knows. On the way back home, Mrs. Streeter stopped by the local shop, La Michoacan Tienda Mexicana, the getting place for the Hispanic folk. She had never set foot in there. For some reason, she just didn't feel comfortable going in there. She reckoned they didn't sell anything she couldn't get at the IGA or the local dollar store. But she knew it had a particular reputation among the local folk for its extra thick pork chops. Her sister swore by them. I mean to tell you, it's the best pork I ever put in my mouth. They say he buys his hogs whole from a little farm over near Kinston. Talk like the farmer only feeds the pigs mostly fruit. That's some sweet meat, girl. You hear me? The place looked like any other convenience store except for the many colorful signs and banners advertising in Spanish, and all about were phone cards for sale, and even some cell phones. The place was quite orderly and kempt. She didn't know what she had expected. Hello, she said to the young woman behind the counter. I'm looking for Marisol Cifuentes. Would you happen to know her? Or Demetrios Cifuentes or the children? The young woman, a girl really, shook her head no. I'm sorry, I do not know this woman. Mrs. Streeter thought about trying to leave a message or ask for some other type of help, but thought better of it. Thank you. After a pause, the woman said, the owner, Mr. Garcia, he might know her, but he's in Greenville. His son is in the hospital. I don't know when he'll be back. The widow thanked the young lady and returned to her car and went home. Weeks passed. Things got better bit by bit, inch by inch. Eventually, Mrs. Streeter was able to replant her garden with a few items, mostly cabbage and collards and mustard and kale. It being August, the growing season was going to be mighty short. It would start to frost in about 6 weeks. You could already sense the fall coming. The community slowly rebuilt, very slowly. Many homes were already remained gutted and vacant. Some stores had opened and restocked. The county and groups like the Red Cross and church associations were still showing up in trucks, loaded with free bottled water and canned goods. And this one crusading minister who was famous in eastern North Carolina for driving to the aid of hurricane victims with hammer, nail, and a strong back. Yet places near the coast were still impassable. Most of the schools had finally reopened after weeks. Wilmington was essentially an island, the governor said. Did you hear about Malcolm Terrell, Percy's son? You know, the one with all them hog factory farms. You hear about what happened at his walled-off country club golf course over near Crosstown? Well, you know he built that big old house right smack dab plumb on the riverbanks. They call that place Biltmore East. With all that expensive timber he found at the bottom of the river. I ain't never been in there, but folks talk about how it's some kind of fancy. A real palace-like, great big. Well, that place flooded. And you know the hog lagoons with all that hog shit spilled over in the river? Along with dead hogs from his farms. I was told when his mansion flooded, not only was the first floor filled with shit, but with dead hogs too. Now, ain't that something? God don't like ugly. I'm telling you. A week before Thanksgiving, Mrs. Streeter heard her doorbell. She wasn't expecting anyone at this time of day. It was the postman. Good morning, ma'am. This letter came to you. It's foreign. I don't want to leave it in the mailbox. It looks important. I figured you might want to see it right away. She thanked the man. The letter in hand had a fancy, colorful stamp, and the postmark read, Ciudad Juarez, Chihuahua. Mrs. Streeter returned to her chair and opened the handwritten letter. The printing was very neat. Dear Mrs. Vanessa Streeter, my name is Sonia Ruiz. We never met, but I was the elementary school teacher of Marisol Cifuentes and a friend of her family. I have known Marisol for most of her life. You should know I was born in York County, where my parents were migrant workers in the 1970s, so I know your town. Some local church people took pity on me and sponsored my education at East Carolina University. Despite my U.S. citizenship, I decided to return to Chihuahua to care for my ailing mother in 1990 and decided to stay. In either case, I wanted you to know this. During the hurricane 2 months ago, Marisol's little girl was lost in the flood. Marisol and Simitro and Inez survived, but Marisol was heartbroken, as you could imagine. She returned to Chihuahua with the aid of Mr. Ramon Garcia, who I understand runs a local grocery store in your town. Marisol and Inez made the trip okay. She came to see me after she arrived. Things were quite fine, though she was sad, as you can understand. She spoke very well of you and said you were a very kind lady. 2 weeks after returning home, something very bad happened. As you no doubt have heard, there are some very wicked men in our province, men who always wish to get their way no matter what they must do. Marisol's younger brother, Jaime, was kidnapped by one of these men, and the family could not pay the ransom. The entire family has been missing for 2 weeks. I found your address among Marisol's things at her mother's house. I thought you should know. I will certainly contact you if I get word of their whereabouts and what has become of them. I pray to God that they remain safe. I understand you're a woman of faith. Please pray for them. Very sincerely yours. She dreamed of her late husband, now dead 10 years, and she dreamt of her grandchildren and their parents and all their various pursuits. She dreamt of her little friends as she thought of them and their mother. Who worked so hard, and she dreamt of a way to raise them all and make them a part of her family. In the dreams, the pain felt camellia petals soft and bearable, and her heart was eased somewhat. The next morning, Vanessa Streeter was woken by the sound of a weed eater attacking her front yard edges. The telltale world was somehow comforting. She had slept late for her, but Herman Chasen liked to start his yard work on the early side. As she lifted herself and thought about the day ahead of her and of what she was planning to cook for supper, it occurred to her this would be a great day for pork chops. Thank you.